The sound of my heels echoed across the marble foyer, sharp and deliberate. Every eye at the dinner table turned toward me as I set the folder down like a gavel. No apology. No smile. My sister blinked, her hand protectively brushing the curve of her belly. My mother's face fell, somewhere between confusion and the first sting of panic. I could almost see the gears grinding behind her eyes, trying to rewrite the script of the evening she'd planned so perfectly. "Well?" I asked, my voice smooth, calm, dangerous. Nobody spoke. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and inside, I waited. For once, they would listen. And they'd understand exactly what I'd built while they were too busy passing around ultrasound photos and hand-embroidered bibs. Dinner at my parents' house had always been a quiet kind of punishment. The chairs never changed, the smells never shifted. Same roast beef. Same clinking cutlery. Same hierarchy. Except this time, there was a new golden crown at the table. And it wasn't Daniel anymore. It was my younger sister, Celeste, pregnant, radiant, and exactly what my mother always wanted me to be. "Oh, Vanessa," Mom had trilled the second I stepped in from the cold. "Doesn't Celeste look stunning? She has that glow, don't you think?" Celeste did look beautiful in that soft, aching kind of way. Her hands constantly cradled her belly like it was made of glass. And everyone, Mom, Dad, even Aunt Lorraine, treated her like she was already some kind of sacred vessel. "She's barely in her second trimester," I murmured, hanging up my coat. "But it's happening," Mom gushed, lowering her voice like it was some state secret. "A baby. I'm finally going to be a grandmother. Can you imagine?" I could imagine it. Very clearly. I just didn't care. We sat down around the table, every detail screaming special occasion. Cream linen napkins. Gold-trimmed china. And in the center, a small white cake, already inscribed in pink frosting. It's a girl. It wasn't even a gender reveal. Mom had guessed. And she'd already baked the cake. That told you everything. The wine skipped me entirely. "You'll want to stay sharp," Mom whispered, not bothering to ask if I even wanted a drink. "There's so much to take in tonight." "Oh," I asked, keeping my tone light. "What else are we celebrating?" "Well, Celeste and Darren just got approved for the townhome in Oakmere Valley." She beamed. "You know the ones by the lake, right? 3 bedrooms, walk-in pantry, a community garden." I nodded slowly. I didn't know those townhomes. Mostly because I owned 2 of them. Quietly. Anonymously. Celeste gave a bashful smile. "It's not huge, but it'll be perfect for the baby. And Mom's already picked out the nursery theme. She won't stop texting me links to wallpaper." "Woodland animals," Mom said with reverence, like she was talking about a Monet. The table chuckled. I didn't. Instead, I set down my fork and asked a simple question. "And how are they paying for it?" Dead silence. "Vanessa," Mom said with a laugh that was half warning, half desperation, "we don't talk about finances at the table." "Right," I replied, my smile thin. That rule never seemed to apply when Celeste got her student loans paid off. Or when she crashed your car and you covered the deductible. Celeste flinched. A soft gasp came from Aunt Lorraine. And Mom. Mom gave me the same look she always did when I stepped out of the script, like I was a malfunctioning appliance. "You know," she began, her voice like honey with a knife inside, "not everything has to be a competition. You should really try being happy for your sister." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the cake. I had been happy once. But years of silence, side comments, and being invisible at my own family's table had turned that happiness into something sharper, something colder. And tonight, as they celebrated someone else's future like it was a holy event, I finally saw it for what it was. This wasn't just dinner. It was war. They'd always said I was the independent one. Code for, we'll forget to check in unless we need something. When I started flipping small fixer-uppers in my mid-20s, no one noticed. When I paid off my first mortgage solo, Mom told me to be careful, property is risky. Meanwhile, she was co-signing Celeste's car lease. Every inch of success I'd built came without applause. But I didn't do it for applause. I did it for control. Behind the dull concrete walls of my downtown apartment, where my family assumed I scraped by, I orchestrated a quiet empire. 9 properties. 2 undershell companies. 3 on the same block where Celeste was moving in. 1 in her own building. All profitable. All hidden. My tenants knew me as Ms. Vale, never Vanessa. My mother knew me as the unmarried one. Back at the table, Celeste was detailing her birthing plan. Something about water therapy and lavender oils. Mom nodded like she was being told the secrets of the universe. Vanessa, Celeste asked suddenly, if you're not busy around March, maybe you could help out? You know, just for the first couple weeks. Mom jumped in before I could reply. Isn't that sweet? It would be good for you, Vanessa. You're so unoccupied these days. My jaw clenched. Unoccupied. They had no idea what I did. Where I went. Who depended on me for housing, for leadership, for structure. To them, I was the girl who had never settled down, never had a child, never given my mother a reason to brag in the checkout line at the grocery store. But something shifted inside me that night. Something final. I didn't want a seat at their table anymore. I wanted to own the whole damn building it sat in. There are moments in life when silence weighs more than noise ever could. The kind of silence that creeps beneath the skin, slow and smothering, like fog filling a locked room. That was the silence that sat with me the morning after that first dinner, heavy, unresolved, stretched across the small living room of my apartment like an unwanted guest. The sunlight didn't come through the windows that day. It just sort of hovered outside, muted, like even the city wasn't sure what to make of what had happened. I sat still, cross-legged on the couch, a cup of coffee untouched on the table in front of me, the steam rising then disappearing into nothing. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. The anger had been exhausted years ago, wrung out and worn thin by every backhanded comment, every comparison disguised as encouragement, every time my mother's voice skipped over mine like I was a page she didn't need to read. I wasn't bitter either. I had buried that too. What I felt now was something colder, clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't scream. It just sharpens. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me. A message from Lisa, short and to the point, everything's ready. I didn't need more than that. She knew what this was. She didn't ask questions when I spent hours at the office over the past few days reviewing legal filings, deed transfers, tax records. She didn't flinch when I asked her to reprint every single file in full color, with embossed tabs and matching folders. Lisa had seen the kind of girl I used to be, the one who came into the office early and left after dark, never bragging about how many properties she'd acquired, never explaining why she didn't have time for company parties or small talk. She had seen the work. And now she would see the point. The packet, my packet, sat neatly in my bag, heavy in weight but not in burden. If anything, it gave me a kind of peace. For years, I had watched my family celebrate Celeste's every milestone like she was the first person in history to have a life worth noticing. First recital? She got flowers. First breakup? She got a spa day. First internship? Dad rented her a car. When I bought my first house, I didn't even get a well done. I had walked the property line alone that day, keys in hand, heart pounding with a kind of joy I didn't know how to share because no one had ever taught me how to celebrate myself. But I had learned. And now it was time they learned too. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I just arrived, 20 minutes early, walking up the same old porch steps that still had the faint squeak I remembered from childhood. The wreath on the door was different, now pink, decorated with a tiny wooden plaque that read Grandma to Be, but the feeling was the same. That ache in the chest that came from walking into a place that had always belonged more to my sister than it ever did to me. Mom opened the door with her arms outstretched, her eyes bright with expectation. Vanessa, she said, like she was performing the act of greeting a daughter she didn't really know. You're early. Traffic was light, I answered, stepping inside. I didn't hug her. She didn't seem to notice. The house smelled like rosemary and lemon zest. Chicken, probably. Mom's signature. She cooked like it was her love language, though somehow the warmth never quite reached me. Celeste was already there, perched on the edge of the couch like some delicate porcelain figure, her belly framed perfectly in a cream maternity dress. Darren stood behind her, hand resting protectively on her shoulder, his other one texting with his thumb. Aunt Lorraine sat by the window, glasses perched low on her nose, knitting something pink with unnecessary drama. I took my usual seat, the one farthest from the head of the table, and placed my bag on the floor beside me. Nobody asked what was in it. Nobody even glanced. They never did. Mom bustled in and out of the kitchen with platters, narrating every detail of the meal like it was a cooking show. The chicken is free-range, the vegetables organic, the bread fresh from that little place in Oakmere that Celeste loves. Everything revolved around Celeste, even the menu. You'll want to try the couscous, Mom said, setting a dish down with pride. Celeste's been craving it nonstop. I nodded, though I had no intention of eating. Celeste smiled, that sweet, modest smile she'd perfected over the years. It's not a real craving, I just like the texture. Everyone chuckled, like that was the most charming thing they'd ever heard. Darren leaned in to whisper something in her ear, and she laughed. It wasn't forced, but it was loud. Loud enough to make sure it echoed. Dinner began without ceremony, as it always did. Forks clinked, glasses were raised. Dad sat silently at the end of the table, nodding occasionally, sipping his wine like it was the only comfort left in the room. I watched him for a while, wondering how many words he'd swallowed for the sake of keeping peace. Wondering how many of mine he'd heard and chosen not to repeat. So, Mom said, cutting into her chicken with precision, Vanessa, how's that little apartment of yours? There it was. The familiar opener. Friendly, pointed, wrapped in lace. It's still standing, I said. Surviving the winter. Must be tight, she continued, not even pretending it was a question. Especially in that part of town. But I suppose you're used to doing more with less. The dig was gentle, polished over the years. I felt the old instinct to smile, to let it pass, to be the good daughter who didn't rock the boat. But the tide had already changed. They just didn't know it yet. Celeste leaned in, resting her chin on her hand. You should think about moving near us. Oakmere's beautiful, peaceful, safe. We're getting to know our neighbors already. One of them teaches prenatal yoga. You know, Darren added, they're building a new duplex unit across from ours. Could be a good fit for someone living alone. It was almost funny. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down without a sound. I already own the unit across from yours, I said, my voice soft, almost tender. Have for 2 years. Celeste's brows knit together. Darren blinked. Mom looked up from her plate, confused. I'm sorry, she said. I reached down, pulled the folder from my bag, and slid it onto the table like a final hand in a high-stakes card game. These are my properties, I said. All 9, including 2 in Oakmere Valley. A beat. Then another. Mom's hand hovered above her glass, unmoving. Celeste reached for the folder, flipping it open with the caution of someone disarming a bomb. Deeds. Tax documents. Closing statements. Photos. A quiet empire laid bare in legal print. You own them, she whispered, still not fully processing. I nodded once. But how? Carefully, I said. Over time. While you were raising gender reveal cakes and planning baby showers, I was closing deals. While you were bragging about Celeste's nursery theme, I was negotiating roof repairs on 3 of your future neighbors' homes. Mom's lips parted, but no words came out. You've always said I had no direction, I continued. You assumed I had no ambition. But what I had was a plan. And just because I didn't need applause doesn't mean I wasn't keeping score. Dad looked at me then, really looked at me. And in that moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or something close to pride buried under years of silence. Celeste closed the folder and pushed it gently back across the table. You could have told us, she said, quiet. I stared at her. I could have. But you never asked. The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment, all I could hear was the creak of the house settling around us, an old skeleton realizing it might not be as solid as it thought. I didn't finish my meal. I didn't wait for dessert. I stood, lifted my coat from the back of the chair, and left the folder where it sat, like a lit candle in the center of the table. Let them look through it after I was gone. Let them flip page after page and see what it felt like to be the ones out of the loop. Outside, the cold air bit at my skin, but I didn't shiver. For once, I didn't feel small walking away from that house. For once, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like something far more dangerous. I felt seen. There's a stillness that settles in the hours after a confrontation, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful so much as suspended, like the whole world is holding its breath, unsure whether the storm has passed or is simply circling back around. That was the kind of stillness I lived in during the days that followed that Sunday dinner. My phone stayed silent, not a single message from Mom, not a vague apology text from Celeste. No passive-aggressive voicemails. No invitations to lunch. Nothing. Not even a reaction to the folder I had left on the table, though I knew without question that they had read every page, probably more than once, probably in silence, probably wondering how they'd missed all of it. I kept going. I woke up each morning before dawn, showered, dressed, opened my laptop, checked my inbox, reviewed property updates, returned calls, reviewed repair estimates, answered questions from tenants. Nothing had changed in my routine. But everything had shifted. And it wasn't just in me. Something subtle had cracked open in the world around me. I could feel it, like an invisible thread that had snapped and was slowly unraveling something much larger than any of us had anticipated. It was Wednesday when the first unexpected ripple came. Lisa walked into my office just after noon, carrying a pale pink envelope with no return address. Her face was unreadable as she handed it to me. It was dropped off by courier, she said, setting it down carefully in front of me. No signature required. I stared at it for a moment, then picked it up. The handwriting was familiar. Not Mom's. Not Celeste's. It was shakier, more deliberate, like someone unused to writing letters had tried very hard to make it look neat. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded card, plain, no frills, just cream cardstock with gold edging. The kind you'd find in a store that smelled like lavender and generational guilt. The message was short. Meet me Friday, 10 a.m. Corner table at Hazel and Pine. Come alone. Dad. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No warm greeting. Just a command with a time and place. I stared at the card for a long time before I said anything. Hazel and Pine was a quiet cafe on the east side of town, tucked between an antique bookstore and a flower shop that always seemed to be in bloom no matter the season. It was the kind of place you went when you wanted to be somewhere but not be seen. A place where whispered conversations dissolved into the hum of espresso machines and soft indie music. Lisa tilted her head. Everything okay? I nodded once. We'll see. The next 2 days passed in a blur of half-finished to-do lists and scattered focus. I told myself it didn't matter, that whatever Dad had to say, it was too late anyway, but the truth was I couldn't stop thinking about it. He had barely spoken that night at the table. He'd watched, yes, his eyes flickering between Mom and me like he was tracking the arc of a falling star, but he hadn't said much beyond a single phrase that still echoed in my head. She's right. I had clung to that phrase more than I wanted to admit. Not because it made anything better, but because it was the first time in my entire life that he had ever taken my side without being asked. And I didn't know what to make of it. Friday came cold and wet. Rain slid down the windows of the cafe in long, trembling lines, blurring the world outside into vague shapes and smeared colors. I arrived 5 minutes early and took the seat in the corner, just as he'd asked. I didn't order anything. I just sat there, coat still on, fingers clasped in my lap, my heart not racing, but definitely awake. He arrived on time. My father had always looked like a man who tried very hard not to take up space. Tall, yes, but quiet. Reserved. The kind of man who walked with a slight hunch, not from age, but from years of shrinking himself to make room for louder voices. He was wearing his usual wool coat and brown leather gloves, and when he spotted me, he offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat down across from me and took off his gloves slowly, placing them on the table like they were fragile. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. I didn't reply right away. I just looked at him, waiting. I read the folder, he added after a moment. Twice. I nodded once. Good. You've done more than I knew, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, like it had traveled too far without being used. Much more. I didn't do it to impress anyone, I said. Least of all her. I know, he replied. That's why it matters. A waitress passed by and refilled a nearby table's coffee. He glanced at her but didn't signal. Neither did I. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he said quietly. I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. For what? For the silence, he said. For being there, but not really being there. For watching what happened in our house and telling myself it was easier not to interfere. I swallowed, the knot in my throat sharp and sudden. You always said you loved calm, I said. That you just didn't want fighting. I did love calm, he admitted. But what I loved more was not being uncomfortable. And I let that comfort become more important than fairness. More important than seeing what was right in front of me. I looked at him for a long moment, unsure what I was supposed to feel. Gratitude? Relief? Sadness? I felt all of it. And none of it. She still doesn't see it, I said. Celeste either. No, he said. And I don't think they will. Not right away. Maybe not ever. That doesn't make it okay. I'm not saying it does, he replied. But I wanted you to know that I saw you. That I see you now. And I wish I had said something sooner. We sat in silence after that, not heavy this time, but hollow. A pause too long to fill. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. There's something else, he said. Something you should know. My pulse stirred. What? He hesitated, glancing toward the door, then back at me. Your sister's place, he said slowly. The townhome she's moving into, it was gifted. I frowned. What do you mean gifted? I mean your mother helped pay for it, he said. But not from savings. She took out a second loan. Against our house. The words landed like a crack of thunder in a quiet field. What? I said, louder than I meant to. She didn't tell anyone, he continued. She used her name, kept the documents off the books. I only found out because the bank sent a letter addressed to me. Why? I asked. Why would she risk the house for that? Because she needed Celeste to have something, he said. Something big. Something worth bragging about. She couldn't stand the idea that you, quiet, practical you, had more. I sat back in my chair stunned. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. You didn't stop her, I said. I tried, he replied. But she said it was her turn to give Celeste something real. That you didn't need help, and Celeste did. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing through the anger. She's going to lose everything, I said. Not if someone steps in, he replied. I opened my eyes. You want me to fix it? He didn't answer right away, but I could see it in his face. Not a request. A hope. Maybe even a prayer. I don't want her to suffer, he said. But I also don't want you to carry this family's burden like you've always had to. That's not fair either. None of this is fair, I said. And now she's bringing a child into it. He looked at me, really looked at me. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel around him for years. Respect. But respect wasn't enough to erase the past. Only action could do that. And I had plenty of action left to take. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was restless or anxious or turning over every sentence of my father's confession like a puzzle missing its last piece. I didn't sleep because my mind had moved into a different gear entirely. Not worry. Not anger. Calculation. The kind of mental shift that happens when something breaks for good, and instead of trying to fix it, you decide to build something new on top of the wreckage. I sat at my desk in the dark, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop screen, the soft buzz of city noise rising from the street below. I had opened every document again, every title deed, every mortgage, every invoice, every email chain from the last 4 years. I needed to remind myself not of what I owned, but of what I had earned, through long nights and scraped knuckles, through bad plumbing and worse tenants, through judgmental neighbors and endless silence from the people who should have noticed my effort the most. And now here I was, holding the weight of a decision that could shatter the fragile shell my family had been living inside for years. My mother had taken out a second loan on their home. Their only home. The one she claimed to cherish. The one that had been her kingdom, her fortress of pride, her permanent stage to parade her golden daughter across. And she had mortgaged it in secret to buy Celeste a home in Oakmere Valley, just so her new grandchild would have a nursery with crown molding and a sun-facing window. She hadn't told my father, hadn't told Celeste, not out of love, but out of desperation. She couldn't stand that I had built something without her. She couldn't stand not being in control. And now she was drowning in a pool she had dug herself. I thought about the baby, about the house, about my sister living in a home she thought was a gift, when in truth, it was a debt disguised as generosity. And for a brief, flickering moment, I thought about letting it all burn. Letting the truth fall out in pieces, letting the bank send that final letter, letting the world tilt and fall until my mother had to stand in the same silence she had forced me into for years. But I didn't want ashes. I wanted clarity. And so I made a call. I met with my lawyer the next morning, crisp and early, over coffee and a manila envelope thicker than usual. Her name was Tara, sharp-witted and expensive. She'd handled every one of my transactions since I bought my first duplex on the east side, and she never asked more than she needed to. I laid it out carefully. I want to purchase the loan, I said. Quietly. Anonymously. I want to hold the deed, not foreclose. I want full control of the asset and the lien, but I don't want them to know it's me. Not yet. Tara raised an eyebrow. Personal. Always. She nodded, making a note. It's doable. Messy, but doable. Make it clean, I said. As clean as possible. Any particular reason? I paused, fingers tapping the edge of the envelope. They taught me how to disappear. I want them to learn what it feels like to owe the invisible. She smiled, but said nothing else. It took 48 hours. Just 2 days for Tara to do what I'd spent years learning how to do, navigate back channels, buy out smaller lending institutions, move money with precision. She contacted the credit union holding the second mortgage. She made the offer in my LLC's name. She acquired it legally, discreetly, without setting off a single alarm. And, just like that, the house I grew up in, the one my mother had once told me would never really be yours, Vanessa, you don't need space like Celeste does, was now mine in every way but name. They didn't know yet, and I didn't rush to tell them. Instead, I let the silence stretch. 5 days passed before anyone reached out. 5 whole days where the air seemed too still, too expectant. I was halfway through a contractor meeting on a small 2-unit reno in the Old Brick District when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I ignored it. 10 minutes later, it buzzed again. Then again. I checked between site walkthroughs and saw what I'd been expecting. A message from Celeste. Can we talk? Please. I just need to understand everything. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked through the unfinished kitchen, running my hand along the stripped wood of the windowsill. I looked at the cracked tile on the floor, the missing cabinets, the exposed pipework. I had spent years making something out of ruins. And now, for the first time, they were standing in the ruins of their own making. It wasn't revenge. It was rhythm. Later that night, my doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised. I opened the door slowly, quietly, and there she was, Celeste, coat wrapped tightly around her, eyes rimmed in red, not from tears, but exhaustion. She looked smaller somehow. Not pregnant, not radiant. Just tired. I didn't know, she said before I could speak. About the loan. About the house. About any of it. I stepped aside, let her in. She sat down on the edge of my couch like it was a stranger's home. Maybe it was. I thought Mom was just being generous. I thought she finally saw me. She didn't do it for you, I said calmly. She did it to outdo me. Celeste didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded. She says you're trying to punish her, she said. I smiled slightly. I'm not trying. I haven't even started. A beat passed. Celeste looked at me, really looked at me. Why didn't you ever say anything before, she asked. About all the things you were doing. The houses. The business. The empire. I shrugged. Because I didn't need applause. I needed ownership. She looked down at her hands, then back at me. I'm scared, she said quietly. What happens if the bank forecloses? They won't, I said. It's already taken care of. Her eyes widened. What? I stood and walked to my desk, pulled out a slim white folder, and handed it to her. I bought the debt. The house is safe. The loan won't default. The title won't transfer. The interest is frozen. She blinked. Why would you do that? I paused. Because I don't want to be like her. And because your baby doesn't deserve to grow up under the weight of her mistakes. She looked like she might cry then, but didn't. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't say anything, I said. Just learn. And for the first time since we were children, she did. She listened. It wasn't forgiveness that changed the air in my apartment after Celeste left that night. It wasn't understanding either. It was something quieter than that, more shapeless. A shift in gravity. Not quite reconciliation, but the soft beginning of something that didn't exist between us before. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. There was no dramatic scene to cleanse the years of imbalance. She left with the folder still clutched in her hands like a passport to a country she never thought she'd need permission to enter. And I stood in the doorway long after she disappeared down the hall, the silence curling around me like the final note of a long-forgotten song. I didn't expect the next call. It came 3 days later, early in the morning. The sky was still silver, the city half asleep. I was on my second cup of coffee, scrolling through backlogged inspection reports, when the name lit up across my screen. MOM. I stared at it. Not out of surprise, but curiosity. She hadn't reached out since the dinner. Not after the folder. Not after the debt reveal. Not after Celeste's visit. I figured she would pretend to be too proud, too wounded, or too busy organizing another room in Celeste's new house to make space for me. I answered without speaking first. Vanessa, she said, her voice sharp but unsure, like someone trying to summon a speech they'd rehearsed too many times and now couldn't find the rhythm for. Yes, I think we should talk. I took a slow sip of coffee. Let the pause drag out just enough. What's left to talk about? You've made your point, she said, and the way she said it made it clear she still thought of this all as a performance, a play in which she was somehow still the central character. The real estate, the documents, the money. It wasn't about making a point, I interrupted. It was about making sure you stopped pretending I didn't exist. Silence pressed in on both sides of the line. And for once, she didn't fill it with deflection or laughter. She let it sit. I didn't know, she said finally, and to her credit, her voice cracked, not dramatically, not manipulatively. Just honestly. I didn't know you were doing all that. I thought. That I failed, I said. That I didn't measure up. That I was just floating through life, aimless, invisible. I didn't think you were invisible, she said too quickly. But even she heard how hollow it sounded. You treated my ambition like a threat, I said. You praised Celeste for every breath she took and only noticed me when I stopped being convenient. You always seemed like you didn't need me. And Celeste did, so she was easier to love? I asked. Is that how this works? Love's a faucet you aim at whoever makes you feel needed. You're twisting things, she said, but her voice had softened. I did what I thought was best. No, I said. You did what was familiar. You didn't make space for more than one kind of success. One kind of daughter. There was no yelling, no sobbing, no slammed phones. Just a silence that felt like something splitting quietly, neatly, without explosion. A rope that finally frayed and let go. I didn't call to fight, she said, smaller now. I called because your father told me what you did. With the house. With the loan. I said nothing. You didn't have to do that, she added. Not for me. I didn't do it for you, I said. I did it for the house. For Dad. For Celeste. For the baby. I did it because I know what it's like to grow up in a home held together by denial and expectations. That baby deserves better. She didn't thank me. She didn't apologize. But for the first time, she didn't pivot either. She let the truth land. There's a dinner next month, she said after a long pause. Celeste's doing a little thing for the baby. Just close family. You could come if you want. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was unsure, but because for the first time, the invitation didn't feel like bait. It felt like a door left cracked open, not wide, but cracked. I'll think about it, I said. We hung up without fanfare. No promises. No illusions. And that was enough. The next few weeks moved slowly, the way all seasons shift when you're not watching. I signed off on 2 renovations, closed on a 4th unit in Oakmere, donated an extra $20,000 to the Horizon Fund under my anonymous name. At the monthly board meeting, Lisa handed me a report with a note clipped to the top. Full occupancy across all properties. Waitlists growing. Legacy in motion. I smiled. Later that night, I drove past my parents' house. The porch light was off, for once. A quiet kind of peace sat over the front yard, the flowers trimmed, the mailbox repaired. It looked smaller now, that house. Not in size, but in power. It didn't hold me anymore. It didn't shrink me anymore. But it was still mine. And then, just a few blocks down, I drove past Celeste's new home. I slowed without thinking. In the upstairs window, I saw movement. A figure, probably her, pacing with soft steps. Preparing for motherhood. Preparing for something bigger than either of us. I didn't feel anger anymore. Or distance. Or the need to prove anything. What I felt was history. Real, unspoken history. A story rewritten, not erased. Back home, I stood at the edge of my living room, lights dim, the city skyline pulsing through the windows like a heartbeat. I reached for the old leather notebook and opened it to the very last page. The lines were blank, waiting. I picked up my pen, the one I used only for pages that mattered. And I wrote, "Legacy doesn't shout. It echoes." Then I closed the book, stood still, and smiled, not because I had one, but because I had finally finished the story the right way. On my terms. And this time, I wasn't invisible. I was unforgettable.